This is exercise 26. It's dealing with the anatomy of the urinary system. The function of the urinary system is to eliminate waste products such as your nitrogenous waste, your toxins, your drugs. It also plays a huge role with maintaining hydration and acid-base balance. From that standpoint, it's dealing with electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and regulating that. It does play a role also with blood pressure. It plays a role also with your production of red blood cells and activation of vitamin D. Vitamin D is necessary for uptake of calcium. You could have all the calcium you want in your diet, but if you're low on vitamin D, you will not be able to absorb that calcium. The four organs of the urinary system are the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. As you can see in this diagram, obviously you have two kidneys. They are not even. A lot of people don't realize that. They're a little bit offset in the location of them. It is in the kidneys where most of the work is going to be done, where all the filtration, reabsorption, secretion occurs, which is involving the formation of the urine. Once that urine is produced, it is going to move down the ureter. As you can see in this diagram, it's the tannish colored tubes that progress from the kidney down to the urinary bladder, which is where the urine will be stored until it can be released from the body via the urethra. Just to put things in perspective, for females, the uterus is located on top of the urinary bladder. This is cross-section showing a schematic drawing of the kidney. As you can see, if the kidney is going to be filtering the blood, it needs to have a very good blood supply. In a course of a 24-hour period, about 180 liters will be processed through the kidney. The blood's going to come in through the renal artery, then it goes to the segmental arteries, which then branch even further into the interlobal arteries, down to the arcuate arteries, to the cortical radiate arteries, and then it's going to move back through the veins and leave by the renal vein. The kidney has a fibrous capsule around it to help protect it. This helps protect the kidney should there be infections in the abdominal area from penetrating into the kidney. The outermost layer of the kidney is referred to as the renal cortex. Hopefully by now you're familiar that cortex is going to be the most superficial, and then the medulla is interior. You have what we call the renal pyramids. This is part of the medulla area. It's pointed inward. The urine is going to be produced here and then flow out of the renal pyramid from that tip into the minor calyx. From the minor calyxes, from each of those pyramids, it flows into what is known as the major calyx, finally into the opening area. It kind of looks like a funnel shape called the renal pelvis, and from the renal pelvis, then it will flow into the ureter. So this is what I was talking about just a moment ago as far as the flow. What I did not mention, because I stopped with the cortical radiate artery, from there it's going to flow into what's known as the afferent arteriole, which flows into the glomerulus. This is the functional unit of the kidney. This is where the filtration process will start. Most everything in the blood other than protein and cells will be processed out of or basically move out of the blood and the glomerulus capillaries. The remaining blood flows out the efferent arteriole, and then it goes to the peritibial capillaries, and this is where select items will be placed back into the blood. Substances that were filtered out can now be reabsorbed, depending on what the situation is at that particular time. How hydrated are you determines how much water goes back in, how much sodium, how much potassium goes back in. It depends on the situation at that particular moment, which might change in 10 minutes. The blood from the peritibial capillaries then will flow into the cortical radiate vein, to the arcuate vein, interlobal vein, to the renal vein, and finally into the inferior vena cava. So that now the blood has been filtered and it's considered clean. It can go throughout the rest of the body. On the cross-section of the kidney on the far left, it is showing, once again, the divisions, the outermost, the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and then the renal pelvis. These are the three main areas of the kidney. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, as I said previously. There's two different types of nephrons. The majority of the nephrons are the cortical nephron, which are embedded mostly within the renal cortex. The juxtamedullary nephron has a much longer nephron loop or loop of Henle. This long loop that descends down, curves, and goes back up, that will extend into the renal medulla area. With the nephron, as you can see from the blood supply, excuse me, the artery goes into what is known as the glomulars. This has the capillaries there where the filtration is going to occur. It is surrounded by that kind of tan, it's a cross section of this. Actually looks kind of like a cup that surrounds those capillaries. This is where the filtrate will be collected, and then it's going to move down the proximal convoluted tubule, down this nephron loop, the old term is the loop of Henle, and then it's going to move to the distal convoluted tubule, and then finally whatever fluid remains will be flowing into that collecting duct. And as you can see on here, the collecting duct, you have several different nephrons attached to it. And all of this will be collecting the filtrate, which is essentially you're forming the urine through this process, through these tubes. And then the collecting duct is collecting all of that newly formed urine. And as you can see, it's going to drain down towards the tip of the pyramid where it drains into the minor calyx there. So if we look a little more closely at the nephron, once again, in the middle here, you can see the capillaries. They come in from the afferent arteriole, loop around so that substances can filter out into that empty space of that glomerular capsule, known as also as the Bowman's capsule. So think of this like an empty cup. And most of the substances in the blood are filtering out because the blood pressure is very high in those capillaries. Things go from high pressure to low pressure. It's like it's pushing it out of the blood into that Bowman's capsule, into that empty space, which then is going to push it down that proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted because you can see it's not straight. There's all kinds of twists and turns. Proximal, why? Because it's closest to the Bowman's capsule. Remember, proximal is closer, distal is further away. In the proximal convoluted tubule, you have this new filtrate. This is the beginning of forming of the urine. So this fluid is flowing through the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule, which is surrounded by the peritibial capillaries. Now, this is where filtration occurs in the Bowman's capsule, in that glomerular area. But in the proximal convoluted tubule, you have reabsorption and you have secretion occurring. What is reabsorption? You are now taking substances that you initially took out that's in the filtrate. So yes, it was in the blood. You took it out. It filtered out of there in the glomerulus. But now in the PCT, and this is where there's all kinds of regulatory controls to determine what's happening right now. Well, some substances will be reabsorbed, meaning you're going to put it back into the blood. So it's going to go out of the PCT into the peritibial capillaries. Now, you'll notice as it moves down, it will go down that nephron loop. You have the descending limb, and then it circles around the bottom, comes up the ascending limb, goes around. Now it's into the distal convoluted tubule, where you're going to continue to have here more secretion occurring. And then the final product flows into that collecting duct. So number one, as you see from the diagram, purple, here you have filtration. So water, amino acids, potassium, chloride. Most substances are moving out of the blood into that empty space of the glomerular capsule. Proteins, cells are too large. They will not leave the blood. So they're left in the blood and they're going to flow out the efferent arteriole and move on down to that peritibial capillary. Now, once you are in the proximal convoluted tubule, you have both reabsorption and secretion occurring. Like I said, number 2 in red, it's showing the reabsorption. You have substances from that filtrate that you're putting back into the blood. Maybe you're putting glucose back in, and water back in, amino acids, things that the body's going to need. And then secretion. Maybe the pH is low, you need to remove some hydrogen ions. Maybe you need to remove potassium because it's very high, creatine. Your secretion is moving substances out of the blood into the tube. Once again, anything that's left in the tube is forming the urine. So once again, this is just showing a little more detail of some of the substances excuse me, and how they're moving. Some of these require energy, some are passive transport, where they are moving. But you can see how through the proximal convoluted tubule, you have substances that are secreting, meaning they're moving into, and substances that are being reabsorbed, meaning they're moving out of the tubule. So you have to be careful which way you're talking about movement of things. Is it moving out of the tubule? Is it moving into the blood, or vice versa? So you produce the urine. What are characteristics of normal urine? Well, normally it has a yellow color to it due to the pigment urochrome. It can be typically a pale, strong yellow color. The more dilute it is, the more pale it is, the more concentrated, the stronger the color is going to be. It should be sterile. You should not have bacteria in it. If there's bacteria in the urine, that's indicative of a UTI, urinary tract infection. It has a slight smell to it. The pH is usually slightly acidic, around pH of 6. And then we do measure the specific gravity. Should be within the range of 1.001 to 1.035. So what's normally found in the urine? Well, you should find sodium, potassium in there, ammonia, bicarbonate ions, urea, uric acid, and creatine in it. Substances that should not be found normally in urine: glucose, blood proteins, red blood cells, pus, which is white blood cells, hemoglobin, bile. Those should not be normally found in the urine. If they are there, it's indicative that there is a problem. Like proteins, that would be indicative that there is a problem with the membrane within the glomerulus. So you form the urine. Like I say, it's going to go from the minor calyx to the major calyxes to the renal pelvis. Now it's going to flow out the ureters. These are the tubes that connect the kidney to the urinary bladder. Peristalsis is going to help with gravity, also that is going to transport it down. If there's a blockage in the ureter or a kink in it, what would happen is that the urine would be basically pushed back into the kidneys. It wouldn't be able to flow. That can cause kidney damage. The ureters flow into the back, kind of underneath on the bladder. The bladder is made of transitional epithelial tissue. Remember, it can expand greatly to increase the volume that it can hold. And then you have the sphincters. There's internal, external sphincters that allow the release of the urine from the bladder through the urethra to expel it from the body. The urethra in females, it's only about an inch in length. Males, it's about 8 inches because it has to travel through the penis. Because the urethra is much shorter in females, that is the reason why urinary tract infections, especially bladder infections, are much more common in females than they are in males. There's less distance, say for a bacteria, if it's going to travel up the urethra. It doesn't have as far to go in a female than it does in a male. Where is the urethra located in females? It's anterior or in front of the vaginal opening. In a males, it's going to travel once again through the penis.